Chapter 7, Mike McDougall. Michael McDougall was not a typical soldier. His Texan father worked as an oil company manager. This explains how Mike spent part of his youth in North Africa. Like everyone from Texas, Mike would say he was fixin' to go, but he could also speak some Arabic. This drew the interest of the Army's assignment officers, who, after Mike enlisted out of the University of Texas, gave him an intelligence MOS, military occupational specialty. They assigned him to Zirndorf, near Nuremberg. Zirndorf is where West Germany processed new immigrants, making it a good place to gather intelligence. As Mike once expressed it, we wanted to know the location of the fire hydrants in every West Bank Palestinian village. In return for expedited processing, the Americans and Germans trolled for informants. The job did not sit well, and McDougall put in for a transfer. The Army then posted McDougall to the 527th MI Battalion in Kaiserslautern, about 90 minutes from Heidelberg. His new responsibilities were minimal, but not inconsequential. In the first months of 1972, Mike settled into place, reuniting with Danielle, his French girlfriend. In the late spring of that year, like our friends back in the States, Janelle and I sat each evening spellbound by the voice of Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The Armed Forces Network, AFN, to its credit, broadcast the committee's Watergate hearings from Washington on radio live across West Germany. Because of the 6-hour time difference, the afternoon sessions came on the air during prime time around 7:30 p.m. Sam Ervin interested me. It had been he, according to the story told by LMDC lawyers, who pressured the Army into ensuring the directives needed for the logistical support without which our Saigon office couldn't have stayed open for more than a few months. Newspaper stories described the crusty old senator with the appealing draw and odd stutter as never without his tattered, pocket-sized copy of the Constitution. I considered myself a personal beneficiary. Along with Danielle and his military buddies, Mike McDougall also listened to the hearings on AFN. He heard John Dean testifying that he warned Nixon about a cancer in the presidency, and Fred Butterworth disclosed the presence of the Oval Office's hidden tape recorders. Witness after witness swore the oath and either confessed to cover-up and perjury or themselves lied and covered up violations of the law and the U.S. Constitution. Perhaps it's too pat, but Mike told me he reached a decision. I was sitting alone in Merzgasse reading a letter from Addlestone about a couple of summer interns we could expect when the telephone rang. The male voice on the line asked for directions. Nothing unusual. GIs needed help finding our office. I provided the shortest route, but in reply, the caller inquired whether we could meet somewhere nearby. Sure, we can go to the Goldener Engel on Hauptstraße. I told him the way to the Bierstube where I sometimes ate lunch. I reached the cafe first. I had no difficulty spotting the caller, plus another GI, both wearing green Army fatigues. They came to the table I had chosen in the rear, where I introduced myself. They each said they'd rather not give their names. I noticed their jackets lacked name patches above the right front pocket. All right, What's this all about? I thought to myself. My guard was up, but I figured no harm in playing along. The young men, whom I came later to know as Mike McDougall, did the talking. He said that they were assigned to the 527th MI Battalion in Kaiserslautern, or K-Town, as GIs called it. He had a night detail running from 6 in the evening to the same hour the next morning. It's a boring job, he said. One of his tasks was tending to the burn bag. This is where I toss all of the excess papers from that day into the incinerator. It's unused carbon copies, drafts of agents' field notes, that sort of thing. Unfinished communications, you know. I nodded as if I did. Anyway, I got to reading some of these papers, and I saw some things I didn't think were right, which you maybe should know about. Yes, I said, already getting the scent of where this might lead. If it involves our work, I'd certainly be interested. Mike replied, Well, I think, but you'd better be better able to tell. The only way for me to determine was by looking at the documents, I told him, trying not to salivate openly. He understood. The men's probe was reaching the juncture where they would have to decide about taking the next step. No, they didn't have any of these papers with them. Obviously, they were in a position to obtain them. This is where I decided it was wise to back off. If someone is considering a far-reaching decision, something he's going to have to live with, you want the decision to be self-induced. Under pressure, there's a good chance it won't stick. I took a few moments to spell out the possibilities. Risks were unavoidable. I would try to keep their identities anonymous, but I couldn't make guarantees. Of course, all of this is highly abstract. I don't even know what all might come to light. Fortunately, I mused, McDougall appeared to be smart enough to take my words. He would weigh the situation, and he had already shown considerable moxie. After 60 minutes and a couple of bratwurst, we said goodbye. I didn't know whether I'd hear from the pair of men again. 10 days passed. I told Janelle about the contact, but she was distracted. Christina and Moira, some months before, had started at a German-American kindergarten, breaking out of the cloister of Mittlerer Geisbergweg. The positive contacts, I even heard them at sunrise one Saturday chatting a few German words, also meant exposure to their playmates' ailments. Predictably, they simultaneously came down with sore throats. Janelle was concerned enough to take them to a local clinic. The Army's field hospital in Heidelberg might have been an alternative, but strictly speaking, we weren't eligible. Certainly it wasn't worth testing the rules over a pair of tender throats. The German physician used a tongue depressor and said he could see red splotches. He wrote a prescription for cough syrup. Janelle stopped. Wasn't it a good idea to take a throat culture? The doctor looked amused. Yes, he would indulge this anxious American mother, but she'd have to take the throat swabs herself. Janelle doubted the doctor's guess of measles, since the girls had been inoculated. The tests confirmed 2 cases of strep. Unfortunately, Janelle's vindication didn't abate the infection, which coursed painfully from throat to ears. Temperatures ran high to the point of resorting to cold baths to stem the fever. Her efforts fell short. One morning, after a difficult night, Christina awoke with skin turned bright red. The once reluctant, now confident doctor told Janelle that strep throat had transmuted into scarlet fever or scarlatina. The difference between the two wasn't clear. Perhaps to him, certainly not to us, though Janelle's Dr. Spock pointed to scarlet fever. Strep is bacterial, so happily treatment was available. We hoped the infection wouldn't turn into rheumatic fever. 2 days later, Janelle received a formal letter by post. I did my best to translate the contents that night. As Janelle guessed from the heading Gesundheitsamt, what she held was a quarantine notice. Our conscientious pediatrician had notified the German health authorities, who under 1939 legislation were ordering our 3- and 4-year-olds housebound for the next 28 days. The news was upsetting. It was also completely unnecessary. Streptococcus is contagious for a period of just 3 days after an antibiotic is given. Quarantine was out of the Dark Ages. Well, not exactly, but citing Nazi law to lock up 2 children unnecessarily struck us as obnoxious. Janelle called the Army's field hospital to talk with a U.S. physician. The American doctor told Janelle he was adding her tale to his journal of strange German medical practices. For the first week, Christina wasn't feeling well enough to leave the apartment. After being cooped up 7 days, her skin finally sloughed off in reptilian gobs. The kids were restless to see friends, especially their hyper-imaginative pal, Tristan. We considered ignoring the quarantine and taking them back to kindergarten. On second thought, Janelle decided the German mothers probably knew about the Gesundheitsamt order and would be wagging their tongues if our girls reappeared even 1 day too soon. Janelle thought up an adventure for Christina, sending her solo to the Bäckerei at the bottom of our hill. After a dry run with her mother, Christina trooped down on her own, returning proudly toting a fat loaf of gemistisches Brot, the hybrid peasant bread we like to toast. Janelle judged Moy too small for the excursion. Max and Uncle Tubby made periodic house calls, announced to the children's delight over the intercom from the steps at the bottom of the garden walk. Gradually, their imprisonment passed. Not without misgivings, I spoke to Max about the visit of the 2 MI enlisted men from Kaiserslautern. They might not return, so the need to involve Max could be unwarranted. He would get excited and perhaps do something ill-advised. I had come to recognize Max's capacity for unilateral action. It was a trait the mad Gerhard had latched onto to declare him unreliable. Gerhard told us he had pressed Max to declare his ideological allegiance, whereupon Max pronounced himself an independent socialist. Gerhard, keenly aware of his own cleverness, condemned this self-appellation as a contradiction in terms. Maybe Gerhard had a point, but I didn't consider the critique to be quite as profound as he did. No, for certain matters, I held Max to be indispensable. He was the interpreter of German politics for us, as he was, in a sense, our press officer. His German fluency was a constant resource. The Citroën was also often the best transportation available. If the 2 MI enlisted men returned, I wanted to take advantage of Max's media savvy. Max was not one to fail to recognize the opportunities for himself inherent in a situation. In the Watergate atmosphere, catching the U.S. Army illegally spying, or at least in violation of our court-martial communications had a high scandal quotient. Max probably started thinking about exclusives he could peddle to the New York Times and CBS the moment I outlined my Goldiner Engel conversation. From the Committee for GI's litigation, he understood the intensity of the U.S. media's interest in the story of GIs versus the Army, a carryover from the last years of the Vietnam War, when the breakdown of discipline was better copy than shrinking U.S. combat. On a Wednesday in the middle of 1973, I got a second call from McDougall. We agreed to meet again at the Goldiner Engel. This time he wore civilian clothes and entered alone. Mike, who told me his name for the first time, said his friend had dropped out. He would be on his own. After a few minutes of small talk, Mike reached inside his nylon jacket and pulled out an assortment of pages, some of them obviously crumpled. He passed them to me. Here, you'll find these interesting. Perhaps I should mention that Mike was matinee handsome and polished like obsidian. He wore voguish prescription glasses with faintly smoked lenses. He was fond of turtlenecks and handled lighting a cigarette like Sean Connery. I intended to inspect the papers on my own time, and I wanted to ask McDougall about another meeting with Max present. But for the time being, I glanced just long enough at approximately 24 sheets to see most were headed Agent's Field Notes. I also saw LMDC, Cesare Bertulli, and No Forn. Mike had delivered a sheaf of golden folios in a Bierstube called Golden Angel. Since his identity was out, he described his background and circumstances, including reference to his French girlfriend. Clearly she had been a factor in his decision. Mike overcame fear, and Danielle supplied political analysis. I said next that I didn't want him to make a habit of lifting these documents. There was too much risk. What I hoped for was enough material to show the military was violating the rights of LMDC's clients. Mike made no objection to what I was saying. I explained there was someone whom I wanted to consult and that next time I would introduce him to Max. We agreed to meet in another 2 weeks, when he could again travel on his day off. Back at Merzgasse, taking care not to mention McDougall over the line, I called Max. Later we sat down with the envelope of documents. Some were little more than scraps of no value. Others contained half-finished write-ups of what were evidently summaries of intercepted telephone conversations. It appeared Max was the subject of the eavesdropping. One recorded exchange between him and me regarding Father Bertulli, the witness from Rome in Larry Johnson's case. It concerned me that the Army might claim it picked up this information inadvertently. In other words, not while tapping LMDC's line, but someone else's, namely Max. This seemed to be exactly what had happened, since it was through Max that we located the White Father and brought him from Rome to Heidelberg. Max, the master implicator, was untroubled. It doesn't matter who they were tapping. They could target me, knowing they'd get to listen to everything they wanted to learn about LMDC's cases. I conceded the point. Max reminded me that unlike everyone else who applied to have a telephone installed, he had not been forced to wait 18 months. The men from the Bundespost had done their work in a few days, right after he moved from Ziegelhausen to Dilsberg. We traded a few chuckles going over the documents. They were an object lesson in the hazards of raw data. The contents were rife with glaring error. They identified my sister Lucy, visiting from California for 4 weeks during the summer, as my wife. A GI having the same name was confused with a Mannheim soldier from 3 years before. And Lou and Gail, our summer interns, were huge ciphers. These two students, sponsored by the Law Student Civil Rights Council, stayed with Bob for a few days when they first arrived in Heidelberg. Without a second thought, as he went out the door, Bob asked Gail to drop off his laundry at a nearby shop. Gail got a whiff of sexism in the request and resisted performing the chore. The Army spooks dutifully recorded the incident as an ideological crisis. What about no foreign? Mike provided me with the answer. That signifies the documents are not to be given to a foreign government or agency, which in this case meant the Germans. Was there any suggestion that LMDC's telephone was bugged? We still shared the line with Becker, Laubscher, and Becker. Their calls might be monitored because of the terrorist clients Eberhard and Marlis represented. But McDougall's papers did not uncover a tap on our German colleagues. Mike's next batch of papers contained several references to a couple of locations in Mainz, the Gosner Mission and the Evangelische Studentengemeinde, ESG. Max explained the latter was a center where Protestant worker priests are trained. They had helped Private Terry Bott and the group putting out a Wiesbaden GI paper with a mimeograph machine. Evidently, military intelligence planned to infiltrate the ESG with an agent. It wasn't clear what stage the plan was at, but it had a name, Operation Penguin Monk. Another sheet described the attempts of a covert GI to penetrate a rights conference at the CA, including his detection by attending soldiers when he photographed the license plates of vehicles parked outside. Max and I decided we had enough material to contact U.S. correspondents we knew in Germany. John Sheehan, the CBS News reporter, who himself may have had a background in MI as an enlisted man in Munich 10 years earlier, was a strong possibility. I also knew Craig Whitney from Saigon. He was now the New York Times bureau chief in Bonn. Craig had been my apartment neighbor on Tisock Street, plus the Times office was next door to the LMDC suite on Tudo. I used to attend his organ recitals in Saigon's Roman Catholic Cathedral. Watching Max was educational. Both John and Craig demanded exclusive. And exclusive meant a better stringer's fee for Max. What Max was willing to promise was a print exclusive for Whitney and a comparable television commitment for Sheehan. Max knew Craig and John both had improved chances with their editors if they could say a competitor organization was about to break the story, while simultaneously preserving their respective exclusives. The strategy worked beautifully. Shane came down from Frankfurt with his cameraman and sound technician to the LMDC office on Merzgasse. The next evening, with Walter Cronkite's voiceover reciting, quote, the latest case of government spying, close quote, there I was, wearing a white tailor-made bell-bottom suit from the Philippines and an orange tie picked out by Christina, leafing through the leaked documents. I provided a suitable soundbite. These apparently authentic military intelligence reports give clear proof the Army is violating the confidential relationship between me and my clients. My mother telephoned later to say she was thrilled. Craig Whitney wrote a 23-column-inch story that made the Times front page the next morning. Craig set out the history of LMDC, its role in Vietnam and Germany, as the ACLU of military justice, the unhappiness of GIs, and the military's efforts to squelch dissent, which evidently were exceeding permissible bounds. None of us anticipated the impact these disclosures would have in Germany. The ordinary citizen who learned about the U.S. military tapping German telephones asked himself about the privacy of his own conversations. Could the Army of Occupation eavesdrop on his telephone calls? Sensing the explosive implications of the story, including the no foreign imprint, a reporter from the Frankfurter Rundschau raised the matter with Chancellor Brandt. Willy Brandt didn't know, but a spokesman promised to find out. Max raced around wildly. He now hoped to make story deals with the major German periodicals, Stern and Der Spiegel. In the evening, he came by our place on Mittlerer Geisbergweg to discuss the next move. Joking, I led him into Christina and Moira's tiny room to point out a pair of posters I had long before scotch-taped to the wall above their beds. On Christina's end was a large color photograph of a penguin, and on Moira's side was a similar one of an orangutan. "Look, Max, there's your penguin monk." This was a stretch, since an orangutan is an ape, not a monkey. And besides, the designation for the abortive MI operation, aimed at religious institutions, must have had to do with the priests imagined as black-robed penguins, not the amusing animal posters in my kid's room. In German, a religious monk is called Mönch, which could also help account for the use of the second term. These subtleties, however, didn't deter Max, who grasped the power of a picture suggesting that agents had violated a child's sanctuary. Moving the posters so they would fit into the same frame, he posed Christina and Moira in front of them and snapped their picture. In Max's words, "There are no coincidences," a refrain he attributed to Freud. Max's mother, after all, was a psychoanalyst from Vienna. Rivkin tagged it Max's journalism. Janelle encountered Herr Pfleger on a walk pruning his roses one afternoon around then. As on other occasions, the elderly man tried to engage her in conversation, which wasn't easy since he spoke no English and Janelle's German was nearly non-existent. When I returned home that night, she told me the landlord had been telling her that after we arrived in September of the previous year, he had been approached by the Bundespost, which operated the national telephone service. According to Janelle, the postal officials asked Herr Pfleger to consent to having his telephone tapped, so when the new tenants asked to use his phone, our conversations could be monitored. Now that the Rhein-Neckar Zeitung had made us local celebrities, he apparently felt it was okay to tell us. Janelle said it was her impression that he had agreed to this year-long invasion of his own privacy. I didn't believe she could have comprehended all this correctly, so I went downstairs to ask Pfleger myself. Chagrined, I returned to tell Janelle she had understood quite well. It so happened that out of our own respect for his privacy, we used Herr Pfleger's telephone only once during the entire year, which must have increased the suspicions of military intelligence. A week after the New York Times printed its revelations, Major General Harold Ahrens dispatched an officer to Kaiserslautern from his 66th Military Intelligence Group headquarters in Munich to conduct what Army regulations termed a, quote, compromised document investigation. Mike McDougall knew about this development because he was the unit driver assigned to pick up Aaron's team at the train depot. I figured the time was running short before the spotlight fell on Mike. Rivkin and I rode with Max in his Citroën to K-Town to confer with McDougall about the next move. Mike would certainly be summoned to appear before the investigating officer. He could, Rivkin and I explained, have counsel with him to make sure his right against self-incrimination was upheld. He would not have to make a statement or answer questions of any sort. But once he refused, M.I. Brass would likely realize he had been the source of the embarrassing expose. We didn't think he would face court-martial charges, but it was impossible to be certain. I told Mike that he would be restricted to base, and if he wanted to make a last media splash, he should act quickly. In fact, I said to him, John Sheehan wants to shoot a follow-up on the original story. Max added his counsel to the effect that, quote, the best defense is a good offense. The more the Army is embarrassed, the less they will want to make a martyr out of you. I admired his clairvoyance, but Max was probably right. Danielle, introduced to me for the first time, concurred. We agreed to meet the next day in a hotel chosen by Sheehan. Sheehan's cameraman and sound technician waited inside the room reserved by the CBS reporter. It reminded me of a Motel 6. Mike wore civilian clothes. He didn't particularly look like a GI, not at all, for instance, like the rogue soldiers from Grafenwehr who had come to us for advice after publishing the Benedict Arnold Gazette. Mike chose his words with care and adroitly managed the script we had worked out together. He objected to being made a part of what he recognized as illegal Army activities, and he accepted the risks inherent in exposing these wrongs. His identity could no longer be concealed. Strangely, just as the interview was winding up, a couple of square meters of sheetrock and plaster broke loose from the ceiling. One of us could have been injured, but we ended up laughing and beating our hair and coats free of powdery white dust. Perhaps heat from the TV lights caused the problem. We relaxed after weeks of tension. That evening back in Heidelberg, John Sheehan treated Janelle and me to a splurge meal at the Hotel Europäischer Hof, compliments of Uncle Walter. I ordered an excellent Elkfleisch mit Wildbeerensauce, elk venison with wild berry sauce. My contract year in Germany was drawing to a close. Christina and Moy were the age to start school, and we had set the middle of August for a return to San Francisco. The compromised document investigation finally did summon McDougall for questioning. In what was my last proceeding in Germany, I stood up to announce Mike McDougall's exercise of his right against self-incrimination. Stymied, the Army tried to investigate Mike for possible court-martial. Rifkin responded by naming the officers in the 66th MI Group in Munich as necessary witnesses. The Army promptly dropped the court-martial idea. Willy Brandt established that the U.S. Army went through prescribed channels with West German legal officials before intercepting the calls. Max succeeded in getting his big stories into both Stern and Der Spiegel magazines, the latter with his photograph of the girls sitting before their Penguin Monk posters. Christina and Moira thought the black strips superimposed across their eyes, quote, to protect the children's identities, were hilarious.